Ladies and gentlemen, ideally I need another 3 to 4 hours to digest my herring, pea soup, and pancakes, but don't worry, MacBrien delivers. And what I am expected to deliver to you today is a talk on EU lobbying. It's something that you can imagine I do fairly often, and indeed I was in Helsingissä, not for the first time, a few months ago, doing a talk which purportedly is about the same subject, except that the audience was different. That audience was a bunch of people like me, a bunch of real estate lobbying professionals. So, of course, we were in the kitchen. We were all a bunch of cooks discussing our various recipes, and that kind of thing is not at all suitable for a vast audience like this from different walks of life and real estate. So it occurred to me that in speaking to you, before I get into any broad brushstroke question of EU lobbying for real estate, I know that it's important that you be clear about the relevance of the EU to real estate, which is not necessarily obvious given that real estate is supposed to be a fairly local thing. And actually, that wasn't so easy for me because normally my nose is on the grind with particular topics, and I don't really look at the bigger picture all that often. So this time I had to think about it, and actually it turned out that in preparing for this, Brexit turned out to be rather useful, because I did study that, because I did need to figure out what our British friends are going to lose when they leave the European Union in terms of real estate. And the fact is, they will lose everything. They will lose all the European privileges of real estate. So, in a kind of mirror effect, by going through what they're going to lose, we will get a perfect mirror image of everything that you have. And it's funny, it's not easy for me, traditionally, to talk to my British friends about Europe and real estate because it's psychologically not easy for them. And they have never viewed what they have as coming from the EU. They consider all the freedoms that they take for granted, they consider that this comes naturally from the liberalization of the global economy. Unfortunately, our British friends are right now waking up to an unfortunate reality because no, that's not the way it works. They're discovering that outside of the European Union, we are in an increasingly cold, dark, difficult place where more and more countries are turning in on themselves. And isn't it a fascinating thing that as soon as a country starts turning in on itself, the first thing that it thinks about protecting is land and buildings? It must be the ultimate primordial nationalistic reflex. And we see it all over the place. China. Every time the economy overheats, the political excuse is, well, it's those foreigners who are heating up the real estate market. Let's close it down. Australia, where people are fed up with having their best real estate being bought up by the Chinese. So they're closing down. And who knows? Maybe next week the U.S. property developer in chief will decide that, in fact, maybe the United States market needs some protection as well. And so the fact is that there's nothing that you can do about this kind of thing. Only the European Union, grounded in constitutional law, offers you real protections in the form of what we call the 4 freedoms. Free movement of capital, services, goods, and persons. And All four of those are absolutely crucial to real estate. And the British are going to lose everything. And maybe the most fundamental to us is free movement of capital, because it's free movement of capital that guarantees the right to buy and sell real estate anywhere you want in the European Union without obstacle. I could give you a lecture for an hour on the number of times member states of the European Union, inside the Union, have tried to protect their land and buildings, tried to protect their real estate. Fascinating examples all over the place. Fortunately, every single time the European Commission and the European Court of Justice, sometimes aided and abetted by the European Property Federation, have stopped this in its tracks and stopped it from happening. Only once was it not possible to stop it. And this was in 1992, when the Danish government held the greatest treaty of all European time, the Treaty of Maastricht, which gave us the full powers to the European Parliament and gave us the euro. The Danish government held all of this hostage until they got a special protocol to the treaty. I think it's Protocol 103, but let's call it the Danish Protocol, by which they are able from now until the end of time to control foreigners, that means you, who would like to buy secondary residences in Denmark. Actually, they weren't really concerned with all Denmark. I learned from my president of the European Property Federation, John Fredrickson, that in fact they were only interested in protecting one long, extremely expensive, fancy beach where they didn't like having their real estate being bought out all the time by Germans. But they couldn't protect under EU law. They couldn't protect the beach against Germans. So they had to protect the whole country against all of you. So some of you laugh, and some of you are thinking, those Danes. But be careful, because at the very same time, your government was working on its negotiations to join the European Union, and they did not fail to notice the Danish protocol, but they didn't understand probably too well about the beach and all the rest, and they got scared. And they started asking themselves the question, why did the Danes do that? And is this important? Should we be watching out? Should we be negotiating for a Finnish protocol? However, being good Finnish students, they did their homework. And so they discovered that, in fact, in 1992, the most recent year with statistics, there were in Finland 350,000 summer cottages. And there were that year 7,000 transactions. And of that, 103 concerned foreigners who wanted to buy those cottages, mostly married to Finns. Of the 103, 100 were accepted, 3 were rejected, but of the 3 that were rejected, 2 were overturned in appellate court. So in fact, 1 man or woman didn't get his or her Finnish summer cottage, upon which the Finnish government wisely decided that this should perhaps not be the top negotiating priority for entering the European Union. But the purpose of telling you that anecdote is that everybody needs to watch out. It's amazing what a reflex this business of protecting. It's interesting that in many languages, country and land are very much the same word, and I guess that has resonance. So our British friends are in for some trouble probably there. It will not come in one day. It'll come up like mushrooms after the rain. What I suspect is that it won't really be, most of the time, direct protection. Get off our land. You can't buy our land. What usually happens all over the world is that real estate, protecting real estate, is part of a cocktail of measures that are taken by a country to protect its service industry. For instance, you say, you'd be very welcome in our country, businessman, sir, just as long as you have local qualifications, or we've done a successful economic necessity test, or we require that you do a joint venture with a local guy. And no, you can't buy real estate, but don't worry about that. Your local partner will be able to. All that kind of stuff. As far as the British are concerned, or any other foreigners from the European Union, that's what we can, I think, sadly expect more of going forward. And then, oh dear, I haven't been very good at slides, have I? No, there. No, that one too is. So we move away from that to the other freedoms. I do the slides and then it's not there. Free movement of services, also very interesting. That means the freedom of a Finnish service provider, whatever, an architect, a valuer, a real estate agent, on the basis of his local qualifications to go and practice with or without establishment anywhere he wants in the European Union. That's over for the Brits too. Of course, they'll be able to keep people out, but it's over for them coming in. The Finnish government will have the sovereign right to decide what it wants to do with British service providers. It will not be a European question for them any longer. Public procurement, I see, is up on the slide. Yes. That's over. In Finland, every time you do public procurement for some kind of works, you have to Europeanize the thing. All Europeans get to tender for it. And actually, isn't it interesting that the British were the first ones to make history in this field by trying many years ago in the European Union to protect themselves in terms of public procurement? They wanted to do a big program for redevelopment. They wanted to use developers and make them compete to win contracts for redevelopment of brownfield sites. And they wanted to keep it to themselves. And they probably didn't do it on purpose. But they called the thing English partnerships, which in terms of European law, that's like putting a red coat on a rabbit so that the hawk can see it more easily. And indeed, it was very quickly seen by the European authorities, who, of course, stopped that. The English, I remember, tried to say at the time, wait, European law doesn't apply because this is real estate, bricks and mortar, and that doesn't move cross borders. And of course the answer was, and it made jurisprudence, it made case law, no, of course the bricks don't move cross border, but the services do, and the money does, and that's what counts. Now, of course, the English will be able to do as many English partnerships as they want, and you will be able to too, vis-a-vis the English. Nobody thinks about commerce and construction. That's free movement of goods. So for us, it's construction products. And everybody thinks, nobody thinks. I didn't think about it until I worked on it. But of course, naturally, that goes down too. For the moment, as everything is harmonized with the Brits, nothing changes, but it will over time. And so will the stopping of the free flow. And I guess the next slide is about free movement of persons, which, of course, concerns the construction labor force. And the British probably at the moment are pretty happy about that, because it means that they will be able to decide if they want or not foreign labor. Foreign means you. And foreign labor, which they will be able to have on a contractual basis without worrying any longer about European workers' rights. And of course, any person who comes to do construction work in England will have no right, when he's there, to look for other work in England. So maybe for the moment, that works for them. We'll see how it pans out in the future. Anyway, all this negativity that I've spent half my speech talking to you about, just mirror that. Make it positive. All of that is what you have. That's what the European Union gives you. And my purpose here today is to give you my view that there is no downside to this. There is no downside by which the European Union, in exchange for this, forces you to do things that you don't want to do. Really, history does not show that. You are organized well enough to be players in this and to make things happen in the right way for you and not to be victims of anything. Indeed, quite the contrary. And lobbying, which I finally got to, is the business of doing that. It is the business of making the EU work for you. And so I listed some of the stuff. Indeed, we were able to use the EU and EU state aid law to finally put an end to the situation in Sweden where the unfair advantages on the market, the unfair advantages of Swedish municipal housing companies subsidized by the state and competing on the open market thanks to their subsidies with our people, private housing companies. Only Europe enabled us to do that. In Sweden, the situation was absolutely hopeless. And that had never happened in Europe before, so it became historic case law and then spread to the Netherlands. And now we have EU economic governance, which has nothing to do with legislation. It arises from the crisis and the non-legislative ways that all the member states get together to tell each other individually, here's what you're doing wrong with your economy. You're dragging us all down. Reform. And that has worked very well for us. Getting involved in that has enabled us to make serious progress in reforming rent control in Denmark and planning law in Romania. And finally, of course, there's our normal work, which consists of simply making sure that all of the EU law, environmental, energy, whatever, that impacts you at the end of the legislative process is what you wanted it to be. That, of course, is our bread and butter. And I bet the next slide, yes, is about the EU constitutional principles that protect you on top of it from too much Europe. Subsidiarity, proportionality, conferral, all great stuff, but please do not be naive. These are legal concepts which can naturally be manipulated by politicians, by lawyers, by lobbyists, and which are, maybe manipulated is the wrong word, but which are used indeed by us. We use these constitutional principles to get what we want out of the European Union. Sometimes we need stuff from the Union, sometimes we need the European Union to back off, but it is within our power to make those changes, and indeed, we've invented our own constitutional principles that have pretty much become acquis communautaire. We are the ones who came up with the idea that the very primacy of EU law is so powerful that the EU has to be particularly careful not to legislate in certain fields of real estate that would end up being dominated by other fields that have nothing to do simply because of the primacy of EU law. And I'm very pleased that I dreamt up the usage of the old Bostonian concept of no taxation without representation to keep the European Union from forcing Europeans to spend money on energy efficiency or stuff like that. Because no taxation without representation, because the European Union is a great democracy, but it is not a one-man, one-vote democracy. You understand that. So those things work. And all that you need to know today is that we are capable of making them work for us. And much of what we have done has become acquis communautaire, as they say in the jargon. It's become part of the body of EU law that all new member states have to take on board. What was I going to say after that? It's good to have ideas. It's good to have ideas, but you also need muscle. You need muscle mass. And so naturally, it was a bright idea on the part of the Finnish Real Estate Federation to create the European Property Federation. Correct. But these days, even that isn't good enough. If you want this kind of results, you need more. And so, in fact, for the past 5-6 years, and this is perhaps something I'm personally rather proud of, this whole group has come together, and we really act as one. And as you can see, they each have their own, or most of them have their own fins, and we certainly work particularly well with Suomen oma kotiliitto, and that is very, very important to us. I swore to myself today I would not drag you into the kitchen. I'm almost finished, and I haven't done it. But for just 15 seconds, I couldn't resist. So many people. We have 2 such difficult energy efficiency fights that are on now. Of course, Harry and his gang have this completely under control. But nonetheless, you can never tell. All these people in this audience, maybe one of you looks at that and thinks, oh, Annalie, she's my sister-in-law. If that's the case, tell Harry and his gang, because these are people who right now are very, very important to us. And so, to conclude, I would say this European business, I could bring it down to this. Being successful in this and being safe in this consists of everybody having a double persona. You got to feel as Finnish as ever, but you got to feel European as well. And your leaders in politics and in real estate need to have the capacity to be as comfortable like a fish in water at both levels. That's how you get the job done. And that probably was the fundamental problem for the British. I remember that many years ago, I expressed surprise to Ukko Laurila, the predecessor of Harri Hiltunen, present here today. I said to him, Ukko, how strange is it not that when you consider the difficulty of many Nordic countries with the European Union, how strange that Finland, right from the start, has been at the center of everything, including the euro, including all the most ambitious stuff. And Ukko said, yeah, well, that's probably our nature. You know, we have long debates about whether we want to play the game at all. Then we put it to a vote. And if we decide that we are going to play the game, then we really play ball. You know, for me, that kind of sums it up. It's all about playing ball. Thank you very much.